The sound of my fork scraping against the good china was louder than it should have been. Margaret had picked out that china pattern 23 years ago, standing in the Macy's housewares department with her hand resting on her growing belly, telling me we needed something that would last for Sunday dinners with our family. Now I sat at my son's dining room table, using those same plates while he carved roast beef with surgical precision, and wondered when I'd become a guest in my own family. "Dad, you're quiet tonight," David said, not looking up from the meat. His wife Sandra hovered nearby, refilling wine glasses nobody had asked her to refill. Her parents, the Weatherbys, sat across from me, wearing the kind of smiles people practice in mirrors. "Just enjoying the meal," I said, though the beef tasted like cardboard. Everything had tasted like cardboard since Margaret passed 8 months ago. Even my morning coffee, brewed in the same pot she'd used for 15 years, had lost its weight. The dining room felt wrong, too formal, too staged. Margaret and I had raised David in our kitchen, around the scarred oak table where homework got done and birthday candles got blown out. This mahogany monument with its crystal chandelier belonged to Sandra's vision of what family dinners should look like, not what they actually were. "We've been meaning to talk to you about something," Sandra said, settling into her chair with the careful grace of someone who had taken etiquette classes. "Haven't we, honey?" David nodded, cutting another slice. "Yeah, about the lake house." My chest tightened. The lake house sat 40 minutes north on Cedar Lake, 3 bedrooms and a wraparound porch that Margaret had sketched on napkins before we'd even found the land. We'd spent every summer there for 12 years, David learning to fish off the dock, while Margaret read paperbacks in the Adirondack chairs I'd built from a kit. The place still smelled like her lavender soap and the cedar planks I'd stained by hand. "What about it?" I asked. "Well," David set down the carving knife, "we think it's time to make some decisions. You know, practical ones." Mr. Weatherby cleared his throat. He was the kind of man who wore golf shirts to dinner and called everyone sport. "Richard, what David's trying to say is that the property represents a significant asset. In today's market, lakefront real estate is—" "Dad," David cut him off, but gently. "We're worried about you, living alone in that big house, driving up to the lake by yourself. It's a lot of maintenance, a lot of responsibility." Sandra leaned forward, her diamond earrings catching the chandelier light. "We just think it might be easier if the paperwork was simplified. You know, for your sake." I set my fork down carefully. "Simplified how?" "The inheritance process can be complicated," Mrs. Weatherby chimed in. She taught high school economics and had opinions about everything, especially with property taxes, capital gains. "It's really better to handle these things while everyone's healthy and thinking clearly." The words hung in the air like smoke from a fire I couldn't yet see. I looked at David, trying to find the boy who used to help me split firewood for the lake house fireplace, who'd begged me to teach him how to drive the old boat. Instead, I saw a man in his 30s wearing a button-down shirt that cost more than I'd spent on clothes in 6 months. "You want me to sign over the lake house," I said. "Not sign it over," David said quickly. "Just streamline things. I talked to a lawyer, and he said there are ways to handle the transfer that would save everyone money in the long run. Estate planning, he called it." "While you're still alive to oversee it," Sandra added with a smile that never reached her eyes. I pushed back from the table, my chair scraping against the hardwood floor. "I need some air." "Dad, wait," but I was already moving toward the back door, past the kitchen with its granite countertops and stainless steel appliances that Margaret would have called too fancy for regular folks. The deck overlooked Sandra's garden, where everything grew in perfect rows like soldiers at attention. Margaret's garden had been chaos, tomatoes sprawling into the beans, flowers mixed in with the vegetables, because she said, pretty things need to grow where they want to grow. The October air bit at my cheeks. Through the sliding glass door, I could see them talking in low voices, David's hands moving in quick gestures while the Weatherbys nodded like bobblehead dolls. Sandra stood at the counter, her back straight, already planning something. My phone buzzed, a text from David. "Just think about it, okay? It's for your own good." I deleted the message and walked to my truck. The Ford's engine turned over on the second try, reliable as sunrise. In the rearview mirror, I saw David standing in his doorway, silhouetted against the warm light of his perfect dining room. He raised one hand, maybe in greeting, maybe in goodbye. I couldn't tell the difference anymore. The drive home took 20 minutes through neighborhoods where people were settling in for the evening. Porch lights flickered on, dogs barked behind chain-link fences, and somewhere a mother called her children in for bath time. Normal sounds of normal lives continuing without interruption. My house sat at the end of Maple Street, a two-story colonial with blue shutters that Margaret had painted herself the summer before she got sick. The garage door opened with a mechanical groan that meant I needed to oil the tracks again. Inside, Margaret's Camry sat under a canvas tarp, keys still hanging on the pegboard where she'd left them before her last trip to the hospital. The kitchen felt too quiet. I poured 2 fingers of whiskey into the glass David had given me for my 70th birthday, a heavy crystal tumbler engraved with "World's Best Dad." The irony tasted bitter. I'd been saving the bottle for a special occasion, but tonight felt special in all the wrong ways. The living room held the weight of 32 years of marriage. Margaret's reading chair still bore the impression of her small frame. Her bookmark, a pressed flower from our honeymoon in Vermont, marked page 247 of a mystery novel she'd never finish. On the mantelpiece, our wedding photo smiled back at me. 2 kids who thought they knew what forever meant. I pulled out the phone and scrolled to David's number, then set it down without calling. What was there to say? That I'd built the lake house with my own hands, laying each board while she held the level. That the deed had both our names on it, mine and hers, with instructions that it should stay in the family as long as there was family to care for it. That "simplified" and "for your own good" were phrases people used when they had already decided what you were going to lose. The whiskey burned, but it was an honest burn. I thought about the drawer upstairs where Margaret kept important papers in manila folders labeled in her careful teacher's handwriting. Birth certificates, insurance policies, and yes, her will. The will I'd signed as witness, but never read in full, trusting her to handle the details the way she'd handled everything else with quiet competence. Tomorrow, I decided I'd read every word. Tonight, I'd sit in her chair and remember what it felt like when family dinner meant something other than ambush. Outside, the wind picked up, rattling the windows she'd washed just weeks before the diagnosis. The sound was lonely, but familiar, like her voice calling me in from the garage when I'd lost track of time, working on some project that would never be as important as the woman waiting in the kitchen. I finished the whiskey and climbed the stairs to our bedroom, where her pillows still held the faint scent of lavender and promises I'd thought we'd have more time to keep. The important papers waited in their drawer, silent witnesses to a life built carefully, deliberately, with intentions I was only beginning to understand. David wanted to simplify things. By morning, I'd know exactly how complicated they were about to become. Part 2, the wedding photo and the old key. I woke at 5:30. Same as I had for 40 years of construction work, even though retirement meant I could sleep until noon if I wanted. But wanting and doing were different things, and my body still believed in the discipline of dawn. Margaret used to tease me about it, padding downstairs in her robe to find me already dressed, coffee brewing in the machine she'd programmed the night before. This morning, the coffee tasted like an apology I couldn't quite name. The manila folders sat on the kitchen table where I'd left them after my trip upstairs. Margaret's handwriting labeled each one in blue ink: insurance, house papers, medical, and the one I'd avoided until now: final arrangements. Her words, not mine. She'd been practical about dying in a way that left me feeling foolish for believing we'd grow old together in matching rockers on the lake house porch. I opened final arrangements with the same reluctance I'd felt the day I cleaned out her closet, knowing each discovery would be another small goodbye. Inside, her will lay folded with lawyer-crisp edges, notarized and witnessed, dated just 6 months before her diagnosis. But beneath it, something I hadn't expected. A handwritten letter sealed in an envelope marked, "For Richard." My hands shook as I opened it. Margaret's cursive flowed across cream-colored stationery, the kind she used for thank-you notes and birthday cards. "Dearest Richard, if you're reading this, I'm somewhere you can't follow yet, and you're probably sitting in the kitchen wondering what I meant to tell you but ran out of time to say. Don't blame yourself for not knowing. I kept some things private because I wanted to protect what we built together. The lake house isn't just property, honey. It's the place where David learned to be brave, where we learned to be parents, where we carved our initials in the oak tree that still shades the dock. I've made provisions to ensure it stays in our family, but not the way David might expect. There's a trust, Richard, hidden in plain sight among all these papers you hate dealing with. The lake house goes to David eventually, but only if he proves he understands what stewardship means. Until then, it's yours to protect. Don't let anyone convince you otherwise. Check the safe deposit box. Everything you need is there, including the conversation I recorded with the lawyer. Yes, I recorded it. You know how I am about keeping records. I love you past the point where love makes sense. Forever yours, Margaret P.S. The key David has isn't the only one. Look behind our wedding photo. I stared at the letter until the words blurred, then read it again. A trust, recorded conversations, a key hidden behind our wedding photo, for God knew how long, while I'd been stumbling around like a man trying to navigate by broken compass. The wedding photo sat on the mantel where it had for 32 years, silver frame slightly tarnished, our young faces bright with the certainty that came from not knowing what life could take away. I lifted it carefully, and there, taped to the backing, was a small brass key attached to a tag in Margaret's writing. Safety deposit box, 247 First National. My chest felt tight, not from my heart condition, but from the weight of being loved by someone who'd planned for my protection, even after she was gone. Margaret had always been 3 steps ahead, saving for vacations we hadn't planned yet, buying Christmas presents in July, anticipating needs I didn't know I had. Death apparently hadn't changed her methodology. The drive to First National took 10 minutes through the center of town, past the diner where we'd had coffee every Saturday morning, past the library where she'd volunteered for story time, past the flower shop where I still couldn't bring myself to stop. The bank manager, Mrs. Chen, had known Margaret well enough to ask about her garden every spring. "Mr. Davidson," she said when I approached her desk, "I'm so sorry for your loss. Margaret was such a lovely woman. Thank you. I need to access our safety deposit box." She led me through the vault's heavy door to box 247. The key turned easily, as if it had been waiting for this moment. Inside, thick manila envelopes labeled in Margaret's systematic way. Trust documents, lake house deed, original, audio recording, estate planning discussion, and instructions for Richard. I took everything to the private viewing room and spread it across the small table. The trust documents were thorough, 27 pages of legal language that boiled down to this. Margaret had established a family trust 3 months before her diagnosis, transferring the lake house into it with specific conditions. David could inherit full ownership only after demonstrating responsible stewardship for a period of no less than 5 years. Until then, I remained trustee with full authority over the property. The original deed showed both our names, with Margaret's signature on a quitclaim deed transferring her half into the trust. Perfectly legal, perfectly binding, and completely unknown to David, who'd apparently been operating under the assumption that a simple will meant simple inheritance. But it was the audio recording that made my hands clench into fists. Margaret's voice, thin but determined. "Mr. Patterson, I need to be clear about this. My son is a good man, but he's easily influenced by people who measure success in dollars rather than love. I won't have the lake house sold to fund someone else's idea of a better investment." The lawyer's voice, patient and professional. "The trust structure will protect the property, Mrs. Davidson. Your son will need to demonstrate that he values the lake house for what it is, not what it's worth. And if he doesn't, then it passes to the Veterans Fund, as you've specified. The property will become a retreat for families who've lost someone in service. Your husband will maintain lifetime residency rights either way." There was more. Details about maintenance responsibilities, tax implications, and the specific criteria David would need to meet. But the message was clear. Margaret had known exactly what might happen, and she'd built a fortress around the place that mattered most to us. I drove home with the documents in a briefcase beside me, my mind spinning with the implications. David didn't know about the trust. His talk of simplifying the inheritance suggested he thought the lake house would transfer to him automatically, free and clear. The lawyers he'd consulted had been working with incomplete information. At home, I spread everything across the dining room table and made a list in my careful block letters. 1. David believes he's inheriting the lake house outright, 2. The Weatherbys are pushing for immediate transfer to avoid taxes. 3. Nobody knows about the trust except me and Mr. Patterson. 4. Margaret recorded everything as evidence of her intentions. My phone buzzed, a text from David. Dad, did you have a chance to think about what we discussed? Sandra's dad knows a tax attorney who could help with the paperwork. I stared at the message for a long moment, then typed back, still thinking. But I wasn't thinking anymore. I was planning. The afternoon sun slanted through the kitchen window, highlighting dust motes that danced like tiny spirits in the air. Margaret used to say dust was just evidence that people lived in a house, that sterile places had no soul. I missed the comfortable chaos she'd brought to our home, books left open on side tables, reading glasses misplaced and found again, the sound of her humming while she cooked. I picked up the wedding photo and studied our faces. We'd been so young, so sure that love was enough to solve any problem. In a way, we'd been right. Love had been enough. It just hadn't solved the problems in the way we'd expected. By evening, I had a plan that Margaret would have appreciated for its thoroughness. Tomorrow, I'd drive to the lake house and assess what needed to be done. I'd call Mr. Patterson and schedule a meeting to understand my full authority as trustee. And I'd decide whether to tell David about the trust or let him continue believing he could pressure me into signing away something that had never been mine to give. The whiskey tasted better tonight, less like an ending and more like a beginning. Outside, the October wind rattled the windows, and somewhere in the distance, a dog barked at shadows only it could see. I raised my glass to the empty kitchen, to the woman who'd loved me enough to protect what we'd built even after she was gone. "Thank you, Margaret," I said aloud, my voice steady in the quiet house. "Now let's see what your boy has learned about stewardship." The drive to Cedar Lake took 43 minutes through countryside that Margaret had loved for its honesty. Rolling fields where corn stubble poked through October frost, farmhouses that had weathered a century of seasons without apology, barns that leaned into the wind but refused to fall. She'd made this drive hundreds of times, usually with a thermos of coffee and a paperback mystery, sometimes with grocery bags full of ingredients for the elaborate meals she'd cook in the lake house's tiny kitchen. Today I made it alone, with a briefcase full of legal documents and questions that had kept me awake until 3 a.m. The lake house sat on 2 acres of pine and oak, the driveway curving through trees that filtered the morning light into cathedral patterns. Margaret had insisted on the circular drive. "So visitors can see the lake through the trees before they see the house. First impressions matter, Richard." The house itself was modest by today's standards, 3 bedrooms and a great room with a stone fireplace I'd built from fieldstone we'd collected together. But it was the porch that made the place special, wrapping around 3 sides with enough rockers and Adirondack chairs to hold everyone we'd ever loved. I parked beside the oak tree where David had carved his initials at age 12, just below where Margaret and I had carved ours on our first anniversary of ownership. The bark had grown around the letters, making them permanent in a way that human promises rarely manage to be. The front door key still worked, but something felt different the moment I stepped inside. The air was too still, too sterile. Margaret's presence had always filled this place. Her books stacked on the coffee table, her sweater draped over the back of a chair, her reading glasses forgotten on the kitchen counter. Now, the rooms felt staged, like a museum exhibit of how lake houses should look rather than how they should live. I walked through each room systematically, taking inventory with the eye of a man who'd built every shelf and painted every wall. In the master bedroom, Margaret's jewelry box sat empty on the dresser, though I remembered her leaving earrings and a bracelet there last summer. The medicine cabinet in the bathroom held only basic supplies. No prescription bottles, no personal items that might suggest regular occupancy. But it was the kitchen that told the real story. The refrigerator was empty except for condiments and beer I didn't recognize. The pantry shelves held canned goods arranged with military precision, nothing like Margaret's cheerful chaos of half-open boxes and forgotten spices. Someone had been here, not living but maintaining, keeping the place ready for something I was beginning to understand with sick certainty. I found the answering machine blinking on the kitchen counter. 3 messages, all from the same number. I pressed play. "Hi, this is Janet from Lakeshore Realty. I wanted to follow up on our conversation about the Cedar Lake property. We've had several inquiries from developers, and I really think you should consider our offer. The market is hot right now for this kind of lakefront footage. Please call me back." The timestamp showed yesterday at 2:17 p.m. My hands went cold. I sat heavily in one of the kitchen chairs Margaret had painted buttercup yellow because she said sunshine belonged in every room. David had been talking to real estate agents, not about inheriting the lake house, but about selling it. The second message was from a lawyer I didn't recognize, discussing preliminary assessments and market valuations for estate planning purposes. The third was David himself, his voice casual and confident. "Janet, it's David. Just wanted to confirm that we're still on for Thursday to show the property to the development group. My dad's taking some time to think things over, but I'm confident we'll have everything sorted out soon." I played the message 3 times, each replay driving the knife deeper. David wasn't planning to inherit the lake house and cherish it the way Margaret had intended. He was planning to sell it to developers who would probably tear it down and build some monstrosity with 5 bedrooms and a 3-car garage. The betrayal tasted like copper in my mouth. Not just the financial betrayal, though that was bad enough, but the casual dismissal of everything this place represented. The summers when David had learned to swim in the lake's shallow cove. The Christmas mornings when we'd open presents around the tree I'd cut from our own woods. The quiet evenings when Margaret had read aloud from mystery novels, while David and I worked on jigsaw puzzles by lamplight. All of it reduced to lakefront footage and market valuations. I walked out to the dock and stood where Margaret had spent her last healthy summer, watching loons dive for fish while she planned the garden she'd never see bloom. The lake stretched out before me, dark water reflecting the cloudy sky like a mirror that showed too much truth. Across the cove, other cabins tucked themselves between the trees, owned by families who understood that some places were worth more than their asking price. My phone buzzed, a text from David. "Dad, hoping to hear from you soon about the paperwork. We've got some time-sensitive opportunities we don't want to miss." Time-sensitive opportunities. That's what my son called 32 years of marriage and family memories. I drove back to town with Margaret's trust documents on the passenger seat and murder in my heart. Not literal murder, I wasn't that far gone yet, but the kind of cold fury that comes when someone you've loved and protected decides to treat you like an obstacle to their ambitions. The law office of Patterson and Associates occupied the 2nd floor of a brick building downtown, above a cafe that Margaret had loved for its apple turnovers. Mr. Patterson was younger than I'd expected, maybe 50, with the kind of careful manner that suggested he'd handled more than his share of family disputes. "Mr. Davidson," he said, standing to shake my hand. "I was wondering when I'd hear from you. Margaret said you'd probably need some time to process everything. She recorded your conversations. With your permission, of course. She wanted to make sure her intentions were crystal clear." He gestured to a chair across from his desk. "What can I help you with today?" I told him about the dinner at David's house, about the pressure to simplify the inheritance, about the real estate agent's messages. Patterson listened without interruption, occasionally making notes on a yellow legal pad. "So, your son believes he's inheriting the property outright," he said when I finished. "Apparently. And he's already talking to developers." Patterson opened a thick file folder. Margaret anticipated this possibility. "The trust is ironclad, Mr. Davidson. As trustee, you have complete authority over the property. David can't sell what he doesn't own, and he can't inherit what he hasn't earned." What does earned mean exactly? The trust specifies that he must demonstrate responsible stewardship for 5 years. That means maintaining the property, using it as a family retreat rather than an investment, and showing respect for its history and significance. Selling to developers would automatically disqualify him from inheritance. I felt something loosen in my chest, the first deep breath I'd taken in 2 days. So, if he proceeds with this development plan, the property passes to the Veterans Fund as specified in the trust. He gets nothing. We spent an hour going through the documents, Patterson explaining every clause and contingency. Margaret had thought of everything. What would happen if David tried to contest the trust? How maintenance expenses would be handled? Even provisions for me to live in the lake house for the rest of my life if I chose to. She was very specific about one thing, Patterson said as we finished. She didn't want you to feel pressured into revealing the trust's existence until you were ready. The decision of when and how to tell David is entirely yours. That evening, I sat in Margaret's reading chair with a bourbon and the folder of trust documents. Outside, autumn wind rattled the windows, and somewhere in the distance, a train whistle echoed through the darkness. the same train that had lulled us to sleep on countless nights, carrying freight and dreams through the heart of the country we'd chosen to call home. I thought about David at 12, helping me stack firewood for the lake house winter. I thought about David at 16, bringing his first girlfriend to meet us at the lake, nervous and proud in equal measure. I thought about David at 25, standing on the dock in his wedding tuxedo, while we waited for Sandra to finish her photos, telling me he hoped his kids would love this place the way he had. When had that love turned into arithmetic? When had family retreat become development opportunity? My phone buzzed with another text from David. "Dad, I hate to pressure you, but we really need to move on this. Can we meet tomorrow to finalize everything?" I stared at the message for a long time, then deleted it without responding. Tomorrow, I'd decide whether to give my son a chance to remember what stewardship meant, or whether Margaret's trust would protect the lake house in the only way that mattered, by finding it a family that understood the difference between price and value. The bourbon tasted like resolve, and for the first time since Margaret's funeral, I felt like the man she'd married rather than the lost widower I'd become. The trust documents went back into their folder, but the knowledge of their power settled into my bones like strength I'd forgotten I possessed. David wanted to finalize everything. By tomorrow night, he'd learn exactly what that meant. Sunday dinner at David's house had always been Sandra's idea of family tradition, though it bore no resemblance to the Sunday dinners Margaret had hosted in our kitchen. Those had been chaotic affairs, football games on the radio, David's friends wandering in and out, leftovers wrapped in foil for anyone who wanted to take something home. Sandra's version involved place cards, cloth napkins, and conversation topics that felt scripted 3 courses in advance. I arrived at exactly 6, as requested, carrying a bottle of wine I'd picked up at the grocery store. Not expensive wine. I'd learned long ago that the Weatherbys could detect the difference between $15 and $50 like bloodhounds, and I was tired of being judged by the price of my gifts. "Richard," Sandra greeted me at the door, with a kiss on the cheek that smelled like perfume and ambition. "You look wonderful. Doesn't he look wonderful, Mother?" Mrs. Weatherby emerged from the living room, wearing pearls and a smile that never quite reached her eyes. "Richard, dear, we're so glad you're here. We have so much to discuss." The dining room table was set for 6, which meant Mr. Weatherby was here too, probably already holding court in the kitchen with his opinions about interest rates and market trends. David appeared in the doorway, wearing khakis and a button-down shirt that made him look like he was auditioning for a role in a catalog about successful suburbanites. "Dad, thanks for coming." He hugged me briefly, the kind of hug that looked good from a distance but felt mechanical up close. "How are you holding up?" "Day by day," I said, which was the truth but not the whole truth. The whole truth involved trust documents and recorded conversations and the slow burn of betrayal that had been keeping me awake at night. Mr. Weatherby dominated the conversation through the salad course, explaining why the stock market was due for a correction and how smart investors were moving their money into real estate. Mrs. Weatherby chimed in with statistics about property values, her teacher's voice making everything sound like a lecture. Sandra orchestrated it all with practiced ease, steering the conversation like a conductor directing a familiar symphony. David said little, pushing food around his plate while glancing at his phone every few minutes. I recognized the behavior from his teenage years, the fidgeting that meant he was working up courage to say something he knew I wouldn't want to hear. "So, Richard," Mr. Weatherby said, as Sandra cleared the salad plates, "David tells us you're considering some estate planning. Smart thinking, really, the tax implications alone." "Actually," David interrupted, his voice tight with nervous energy, "we wanted to update you on some progress we've made." I set down my water glass and waited. Across the table, Sandra smiled encouragingly at her husband, while her parents leaned forward like vultures sensing carrion. "I've been in touch with that tax attorney Dad Weatherby recommended," David continued. "He thinks we can structure the transfer to minimize the tax burden if we move quickly. And I've had some preliminary conversations with real estate professionals, just to understand our options." "Our options," I repeated. "For the lake house. I mean, obviously we want to keep it in the family, but we also want to be smart about it. The market is incredible right now, Dad. Lakefront property is selling for 3 times what you paid for it." My phone buzzed against my leg. I ignored it, but it buzzed again and then again. Finally, I glanced down at the screen. 3 text messages from a number I didn't recognize. Mr. Davidson, this is Tom Brennan, your neighbor at Cedar Lake. Thought you should know there were some folks measuring your dock this morning. Said they were from a development company. They had surveying equipment and were taking photos of the shoreline. Seemed pretty thorough. Hope everything's okay. Margaret always said you'd never sell to developers. These guys look like developers to me. The blood drained from my face. While I'd been sitting here listening to speeches about tax implications, strangers had been walking around my property with measuring tapes and cameras. David noticed my expression and stopped mid-sentence. Dad, everything all right? I looked at my son, this man I'd raised to believe in honesty and integrity, who was apparently conducting real estate transactions behind my back while pretending to be concerned about tax burdens. You had surveyors at the lake house today. The silence that followed was the kind that precedes explosions. Sandra's fork clinked against her plate. Mrs. Weatherby's hand fluttered to her pearls. Mr. Weatherby cleared his throat like a man choking on his own words. David's face went through a series of expressions: surprise, guilt, calculation, and finally a kind of defensive anger I remembered from when he'd been caught stealing cookies as a child. Dad, I can explain. Can you? I stood up slowly, my joints creaking like old hinges. Because what it looks like is that you've been planning to sell the lake house before you even own it. What it looks like is that you've been lying to me about keeping it in the family while shopping it around to developers. Now, Richard, Mr. Weatherby interjected, let's not jump to conclusions. Due diligence is important in any transaction. What transaction? I turned on him with 40 years of construction work behind my voice. Who said anything about a transaction? Sandra stood too, her hostess mask slipping to reveal something harder underneath. David, you said you'd talk to him about this. I did talk to him, David snapped. We talked about estate planning, about simplifying the inheritance process. That's not the same as... As what? As selling the place where your mother spent her last healthy summer? As turning the dock where you learned to fish into a development opportunity? The words came out louder than I'd intended, carrying the weight of 8 months of grief and 2 days of revelation. David flinched as if I'd slapped him. Dad, you're being emotional. This is business. Mom would have understood that we need to be practical. Don't! The word cut through the room like a blade. Don't you dare tell me what your mother would have understood. She understood plenty, David. More than you know. Mrs. Weatherby tried to salvage the situation with her teacher's voice. Richard, we're all family here. We all want what's best. What's best, I said, pulling my jacket from the back of the chair, is for me to go home and think about what kind of family I actually have. I walked toward the door, leaving behind Sandra's carefully prepared roast and the Weatherby's carefully prepared arguments. David followed me into the foyer, his voice dropping to the pleading tone he'd used as a child when he'd broken something valuable. Dad, please, let me explain. It's not what you think. I turned back to look at him one last time, this man who'd once built sandcastles with me on the lake house beach, and now wanted to sell the beach to people who'd bulldoze the memories along with the trees. It's exactly what I think, I said. The question is whether you're going to figure that out in time to matter. The October air outside felt clean after the suffocating atmosphere of Sandra's dining room. I sat in my truck for a moment, hands shaking with anger and something deeper. A grief that had nothing to do with Margaret's death and everything to do with watching my son transform into a stranger wearing David's face. My phone buzzed again. Another text from Tom Brennan. If you need anything, Richard, just holler. Margaret always said you were good people. These developers can't say the same. I drove home through streets where other families were finishing their own Sunday dinners, probably with fewer real estate surveys and more actual conversation. The house felt different when I walked in. Not emptier, but clearer. The trust documents waited on the kitchen table where I'd left them, patient and implacable as law itself. I poured myself a bourbon and called Mr. Patterson's emergency number. Mr. Davidson, he answered on the second ring. I was expecting your call. How could you be expecting? Because Margaret told me you'd know when the time was right. She said you'd give David every chance to remember what family means before you had to remind him. His voice was gentle but firm. I take it that time has come? I told him about the surveyors, about David's conversations with developers, about the dinner table full of people who measured love and property values. Patterson listened without comment until I finished. "What would you like me to do?" he asked. I looked around the kitchen where Margaret had made 32 years of breakfast, where she'd planned gardens and worried about David's grades, and told me every day in a dozen small ways that love was a choice you made new each morning. Outside, the wind carried the scent of wood smoke and fallen leaves, autumn smells that meant endings and new beginnings in equal measure. "Send the letters," I said. "It's time David learned about stewardship the hard way." "Are you sure? Once I notify him about the trust, there's no going back to the way things were." "The way things were ended when he put surveyors on my dock," I said. "Now let's see if the way things are going to be teaches him anything worth learning." After I hung up, I sat in the quiet kitchen with my bourbon and Margaret's memory, thinking about the difference between family and DNA, between inheritance and earning, between the son I'd raised and the man he'd chosen to become. Tomorrow, David would discover that some gifts came with conditions, and some conditions were written in steel rather than sand. But tonight, I was just a man who'd loved his family long enough to know when love required boundaries, and boundaries required backbone. Margaret had given me both, along with the legal tools to enforce them. Time to find out if our son was smart enough to recognize the difference between having something and deserving it. The certified letter arrived at David's house on Tuesday morning at 9:47 a.m., according to the delivery confirmation that pinged on my phone. I know because I'd been awake since 5, drinking coffee and watching the clock like a man waiting for surgery results. Some revelations can't be rushed, but they can be timed, and Margaret would have appreciated the precision. By 10:15, my phone was ringing. "Dad, what the hell is this?" David's voice carried the particular kind of panic that comes from discovering the world isn't shaped the way you thought it was. "Some lawyer is saying Mom put the lake house in a trust, that I can't inherit it unless I meet some kind of conditions." I let the silence stretch for a moment, the way Margaret used to when David had been caught in a lie. She'd taught me that people fill quiet spaces with more truth than they intend to share. "Your mother was thorough," I said finally. "Thorough? Dad, this says I have to prove a responsible stewardship for 5 years. What does that even mean? And why didn't you tell me?" "Because I wanted to see what kind of man you'd become without knowing there were consequences for your choices." More silence, then the sound of papers rustling. I could picture him in his kitchen, Sandra hovering nearby while he tried to make sense of legal language that boiled down to a simple premise. Actions have outcomes, and some outcomes can't be negotiated. "This isn't legally binding," he said, but his voice lacked conviction. Mom was sick when she made this. She wasn't thinking clearly. She made the trust 3 months before her diagnosis. Her mind was sharp as a razor, and Mr. Patterson has recordings to prove it. I kept my voice level, matter of fact. "She knew exactly what she was doing, David. The question is whether you do." The call ended with a click that sounded like a door slamming. By noon, I was sitting across from Patterson in his office, going through the next phase of what Margaret had labeled educational consequences in her meticulously organized files. She'd planned for David's reaction the way she'd planned for everything else, with patience, foresight, and an understanding of human nature that came from 30 years of teaching high school. "The trust is bulletproof," Patterson assured me as he spread documents across his conference table. "Your son can contest it, but he'll lose. Your wife was careful to document her mental competency, her reasoning, and her explicit intentions. The recordings alone would convince any judge." "What about the real estate activity, the surveyors?" "That's where it gets interesting." Patterson pulled out a thick folder labeled Enforcement Actions. "The trust specifically prohibits any attempt to sell, develop, or substantially alter the property during the stewardship period. By engaging with developers, your son has already violated the terms." "Meaning?" "Meaning he's disqualified himself from inheritance. The property now passes automatically to the Veterans Fund, with you retaining lifetime residency rights." The words hit me like a physical blow. Margaret had built this system to protect the lake house, but also to give David a chance to prove himself worthy of it. He'd failed that test without even knowing he was taking it. "Is there any way to reverse it?" I asked. "To give him another chance?" Patterson studied me over his reading glasses. "The trust has provisions for that, but only if he demonstrates genuine understanding of what he's lost and why. Your wife was very specific. This isn't about punishment, it's about education." I left the lawyer's office with a briefcase full of documents and a plan that Margaret had designed like a blueprint for rebuilding something that had been broken. The first step was securing the lake house itself, making sure David couldn't do any more damage while he figured out what his choices had cost him. The drive to Cedar Lake felt different this time, weighted with purpose rather than discovery. I'd called ahead to Tom Brennan, my neighbor, asking him to meet me at the house. Tom was retired Navy, the kind of man who understood that some battles required preparation rather than emotion. Richard, he greeted me at the dock, where we could see the stakes the surveyors had left in my lawn like tiny grave markers. Glad you called. Been worried about what those development vultures were planning. They're not planning anything anymore, I said, pulling the trust documents from my briefcase. But I need your help with something. Tom had served 2 tours in Afghanistan before retiring to Cedar Lake, where his technical skills had made him the unofficial IT support for half the neighborhood. Margaret had always liked him because he fixed things without being asked and never charged more than the cost of parts. "You want to install what?" he asked after I'd explained my needs. "A smart home system. Cameras, motion sensors, automated locks, the works." I gestured toward the house that David apparently saw as a development opportunity. "Legal system to monitor and control access to the property." Tom grinned, the expression of a man who'd found a project worthy of his skills. "Richard, I like the way you think. Your wife teach you about strategic defense? Margaret taught me that people respect boundaries better when the boundaries have teeth." We spent the afternoon mapping out the installation. Cameras at every entrance, motion sensors along the shoreline, smart locks that could be controlled remotely. The system would be invisible to casual observers, but comprehensive enough to document every approach to the property. More importantly, it would give me complete control over who entered the lake house and when. "This setup will send alerts to your phone," Tom explained as he mounted the first camera above the front door. "Motion detection, entry logs, even facial recognition if you want to get fancy. You'll know the instant anyone sets foot on your property. And I can control access remotely? Lock or unlock any door, arm or disarm the system, even control the lights and heat. Think of it as a digital fortress." He paused in his work to look at me seriously. "This is about more than security, isn't it? It's about teaching my son that stewardship means responsibility, that you can't claim something unless you're willing to protect it." The installation took most of the day. When we finished, the lake house looked exactly the same from the outside, but every window, door, and approach was monitored by sensors that reported to a control panel in the kitchen and an app on my phone. Tom had even programmed the system to recognize my face and voice, ensuring I could always access the property while maintaining complete control over everyone else. "One more thing," Tom said as we tested the final components. "The system can be set to different modes. Family mode allows normal access. Guest mode requires approval for entry. And there's a lockdown mode that basically turns the place into Fort Knox." "Lockdown mode?" "Motion sensors trigger floodlights and audio alarms. Cameras start recording automatically. All doors lock electronically. Useful if you want to make a point about trespassing." I thought about David's casual assumption that he could survey the property and show it to developers without my knowledge or permission. "Show me how that works." My phone rang as we were finishing the demonstration. David again, his voice tight with barely controlled anger. "Dad, I just got off the phone with that lawyer. He says you've been given some kind of authority over the lake house that supersedes normal inheritance law. That can't be legal." "It's completely legal. Your mother made sure of that." "This is insane. You're my father, not my landlord. We're family." "Family," I repeated, looking out at the dock where surveyor stakes still dotted my lawn like an invasion force. "Is that what we are?" "Of course that's what we are. Just because we disagree about real estate doesn't mean—" "David," I cut him off with the tone I'd used when he was 16 and had wrecked Margaret's car. "You had strangers measuring my dock without my permission. You've been talking to developers about selling property you don't own. You've been planning to profit from your mother's death before she was even cold in the ground. That's exactly what it is. And until you understand why that matters, you're not welcome at the lake house." I hung up and activated the smart home system's guest mode, which meant David would need my explicit permission to enter the property. The cameras would track any approach, the sensors would detect any attempt at unauthorized entry, and the system would document everything from Mr. Patterson's files. Tom clapped me on the shoulder as we walked back to our cars. "Your wife would be proud, Richard. This is the kind of strategic thinking that wins wars." "I'm not trying to win a war," I said. "I'm trying to save a family, even if it means protecting them from themselves." The drive home took me past David's neighborhood, where houses sat on perfectly manicured lots behind elaborate security systems that protected objects rather than principles. I thought about the difference between the technology I'd just installed and the technology that surrounded my son's life, one designed to preserve something worth keeping, the other designed to keep the world at arm's length. That evening, I sat in Margaret's chair with the smart home app open on my phone, watching the lake house through multiple camera angles. The place looked peaceful in the gathering dusk, shadows stretching across the lawn where David had once played Capture the Flag with neighborhood kids. The dock where he'd learned to dive extended into water that reflected the last light of day, like a mirror that held memories. My phone buzzed with a motion alert. The cameras showed a familiar car pulling into the driveway, David's SUV with Sandra in the passenger seat. They sat for a moment, probably reading the discreet private property signs Tom had helped me install that afternoon, then got out and approached the front door. I watched through the camera as David tried his key. The smart lock didn't respond. I'd changed the access codes as part of the security upgrade. He tried again, then knocked on the door, calling my name. When no answer came, he pulled out his phone. My phone rang immediately. I let it go to voicemail. The camera showed them walking around the house, testing windows, checking the back door. Every motion triggered new alerts on my phone, creating a digital record of their attempt to access property they no longer had any right to enter. Sandra appeared increasingly agitated, gesturing at the house while David tried to explain what was happening. Finally, they gave up and drove away, leaving the lake house to its electronic guardians and the memories of better times. I saved the surveillance footage and sent it to Mr. Patterson with a simple message. "Documentation of unauthorized access attempt. Please add to files." His response came back immediately. "Received. This supports our position perfectly. Your wife's plan is working exactly as she intended." I turned off the phone and sat in the quiet house, thinking about the difference between protecting something and controlling it, between setting boundaries and building walls. Margaret's trust had given me the tools to defend what we'd built together, but it was up to me to use them wisely. Outside, autumn wind rattled the windows that she'd washed for the last time months before her diagnosis. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new attempts by David to circumvent the consequences of his choices. But tonight, the lake house was safe, monitored by technology but protected by love, guarded by electronics, but defended by the kind of stewardship Margaret had always believed could save any family willing to practice it. The smart home system would keep the property secure. Now I had to figure out how to keep the family human. The meeting was Sandra's idea, naturally. She called it a family conference, scheduled for 2 o'clock on Saturday at David's house with the kind of military precision she usually reserved for dinner parties. The invitation came via email, complete with an agenda that read like a corporate presentation. Discussion of property issues, resolution of legal concerns, and path forward for all parties. I almost didn't go. The smart home system had captured 3 more unauthorized visits to the lake house during the week. David alone on Tuesday evening, David and Sandra on Wednesday afternoon, and the entire Weatherby clan on Friday morning. Each attempt was documented in high-definition video that showed my son growing increasingly frustrated with doors that wouldn't open and windows that wouldn't budge. But Margaret had always believed in giving people enough rope to either climb out of holes or hang themselves with. So I drove to David's house carrying a briefcase full of trust documents and the cold satisfaction that comes from holding all the cards in a game other people thought they were winning. The living room had been rearranged for maximum intimidation. David and Sandra sat on the main couch, flanked by her parents like a matched set of bookends. Across from them, a single chair waited for me, isolated, outnumbered, presumably vulnerable. They'd even hired a lawyer, a sharp-faced woman in an expensive suit who introduced herself as Rebecca Mills from Mills, Harrison and Associates. "Richard," Sandra stood as I entered, her hostess smile stretched thin over obvious tension. "Thank you so much for coming. We really think we can work through this as a family." I took the designated chair and set my briefcase beside it. Work through what exactly? Ms. Mills leaned forward, her pen poised over a yellow legal pad. Mr. Davidson, my clients have asked me to review the trust document that's recently come to light. I have to say, there are several concerning aspects that we feel warrant discussion, such as the conditions for inheritance are extraordinarily vague. Terms like responsible stewardship have no legal definition. A good judge would find them unenforceable. I opened my briefcase and pulled out a thick folder. That's interesting, because Mr. Patterson seems confident they'll hold up in court, especially given the detailed recordings your client's mother made, explaining exactly what she meant by responsible stewardship. David's face flushed. You can't use those recordings. Mom was under stress, probably medicated. Your mother made those recordings 3 months before her diagnosis, I said quietly. Her mind was sharp, her reasoning was clear, and her intentions were explicit. She wanted to protect the lake house from people who would treat it like a commodity instead of a legacy. Mr. Weatherby cleared his throat, the sound of a man who'd been waiting for his cue. Richard, let's be practical here. The property is worth significant money, money that could benefit everyone if handled properly. Handled how? Sold, proceeds invested wisely. David could buy another lake property if he really wants one, something more suited to his family's needs. His family's needs, I repeated. What about his mother's needs? Her desire to preserve the place where she spent her happiest years. Sandra's composure cracked slightly. Mom Davidson is gone, Richard. We have to think about the living. The words landed like a slap. I looked at David, waiting for him to defend his mother's memory, to show some spark of the boy who'd once helped her plant flowers around the lake house deck. Instead, he stared at his hands while his wife spoke for him. Margaret is gone, I said, my voice carrying 32 years of marriage and 8 months of grief. But her intentions aren't. Neither is my authority to enforce them. Ms. Mills tried to regain control of the conversation. Mr. Davidson, my clients are prepared to offer a compromise. David would accept a reduced inheritance in exchange for immediate transfer of the property. Clean, simple, no ongoing conditions. Counteroffer, I said, pulling out the surveillance footage Tom had compiled. David stops trying to break into property he doesn't own, stops talking to developers about sales he can't make, and starts learning what stewardship actually means. I spread the photos across the coffee table, clear images of David and Sandra testing windows, the Weatherbys walking the shoreline with measuring tapes, David himself standing on the dock with his phone pressed to his ear, probably describing the property to yet another interested buyer. You've been monitoring us? Sandra's voice shot up an octave. I've been protecting my property from trespassing. There's a difference. David finally found his voice. Dad, this is crazy. You've turned the lake house into some kind of fortress. You've got cameras watching every move, locks that won't work, alarms going off every time we try to visit. That's not stewardship. That's paranoia. Paranoia is what you call caution when you're the one being watched, I said. What would you call surveying someone else's property for development potential? The silence that followed was the kind that precedes storms. Ms. Mills shuffled her papers, probably calculating how much her retainer was worth compared to the legal quicksand her clients had stepped into. Mr. Weatherby studied his manicured fingernails like they held secrets. Mrs. Weatherby clutched her purse as if it contained evidence of better investments. Finally, David stood up, his movements sharp with barely controlled anger. Fine. You want to play hardball? We'll play hardball. I'll contest the trust. I'll prove Mom wasn't competent when she made it. I'll tie this up in court for years if I have to. I reached into my briefcase one more time and pulled out a small digital recorder. Old technology, but reliable. The kind Margaret had used to record her book club discussions when she couldn't attend in person. Before you do that, I said, pressing play, you might want to hear this. Margaret's voice filled the room, thin but determined. Richard, if you're playing this recording, it means David has threatened to contest the trust. I want him to hear what I told Mr. Patterson about that possibility. A different voice, the lawyer's professional tones. And what would happen if your son chose to contest your wishes, Mrs. Davidson? Then he would prove exactly why the trust was necessary in the first place. A man who would fight his own mother's final wishes in court is a man who doesn't understand that some things matter more than money. If David contests this trust, he forfeits any claim to inheritance, and the property passes immediately to the Veterans Fund. My Margaret, still teaching life lessons from beyond the grave. The recording continued for another minute, outlining specific consequences for various forms of legal challenge. By the time it ended, David had sunk back into his chair, and Sandra was staring at her hands the way people do when they realize they've miscalculated badly. "So," I said, turning off the recorder, "would you like to reconsider that court challenge?" Ms. Mills was the first to recover. "Mr. Davidson, surely we can find some middle ground here. Family disputes rarely benefit anyone when they escalate to litigation." "I agree completely. That's why I'm prepared to offer David something his mother would have wanted him to have." I pulled out the final document, the one Mr. Patterson and I had prepared for this exact moment. A chance to prove himself worthy of inheritance. The trust allows for a probationary period where David can demonstrate responsible stewardship under supervision. "Supervision?" Sandra's voice was sharp. "1 year. David manages the lake house under my oversight. No development discussions, no real estate consultations, no attempts to monetize the property. Just maintenance, preservation, and respect for what his mother intended. If he succeeds, the inheritance proceeds normally. If he fails, the property goes to charity," David finished, his voice hollow. "The property goes to people who understand that some places are worth more than their market value." The room fell silent except for the tick of Sandra's grandmother clock and the distant sound of children playing in a yard where life continued normally, unmarked by trust documents and family betrayals. Finally, David looked up at me, and for a moment I saw the boy who'd helped me stack firewood, who'd learned to drive a stick shift in the lake house driveway, who'd carved his initials in the oak tree with dreams of bringing his own children there someday. "What would supervision look like?" he asked quietly. "You earn back access to the property. You learn to maintain it properly. You spend time there not as an owner, but as a steward. And most importantly, you remember what your mother loved about the place instead of calculating what someone else might pay for it." Sandra started to object, but David held up a hand. "What if I say no?" "Then the lake house becomes a retreat for military families. Your mother's wishes are honored, and you live with the knowledge that you chose money over memory." I stood and gathered my documents, leaving the supervision agreement on the coffee table. "You have until Monday to decide. After that, the offer expires and the property transfers automatically." As I reached the door, David called my name. I turned back to see him holding the agreement, scanning the terms with the same careful attention he'd once brought to baseball card statistics and comic book prices. "Dad," he said, his voice younger than it had sounded in years, "I don't know how to fix this." "That's what the probationary period is for," I said. "Learning. Your mother always believed people could change if they wanted to, badly enough." The drive home took me past the cemetery where Margaret rested under a simple granite stone that read, "Beloved wife, mother, and teacher." I stopped and sat on the bench I'd installed beside her grave, reading her the supervision agreement while autumn wind scattered leaves across the carefully tended grass. "I think this is what you wanted," I told her headstone. "A chance for David to remember who he used to be before he forgot who he was supposed to become." The stone offered no response, but somewhere in the distance a cardinal sang the bright, clear notes that Margaret had always claimed were messages from people who'd learned to love without conditions. I chose to believe her, the way I'd chosen to believe in trust documents and surveillance systems, and the possibility that families could heal themselves if they had the right tools and enough time. Monday would bring David's decision. Until then, the lake house waited under electronic protection and the weight of one woman's hopes for the son she'd raised to be better than his choices had become. Monday brought rain, the kind of steady October downpour that Margaret used to say washed the world clean for winter. I sat in the kitchen with my morning coffee, watching water stream down the windows while my phone stayed silent on the table beside me. David had until 5 o'clock to make his decision, but I'd learned long ago that waiting for other people's choices was like watching paint dry. It happened at its own pace, regardless of how much you stared. At 11:30, the phone finally rang. Not David, but Mr. Patterson. "He signed," the lawyer said without preamble. David came in an hour ago with the supervision agreement, signed, witnessed, and notarized. He also brought a written apology for the unauthorized property access and a commitment to cease all contact with real estate developers. I felt something unclench in my chest, a tension I'd been carrying so long I'd forgotten it was there. How did he seem? Subdued. His wife wasn't with him, which I took as a positive sign. He asked a lot of questions about the supervision requirements, wanted to understand exactly what responsible stewardship meant in practical terms. What did you tell him? That he'd be learning that from you, not from me. That stewardship couldn't be defined in legal language. It had to be demonstrated through actions. After we hung up, I sat with my coffee and the quiet satisfaction that comes from watching a plan unfold the way its architect intended. Margaret had designed this system with surgical precision, creating consequences that would either teach David what mattered or remove him from the equation entirely. He'd chosen to learn, which meant there was still hope for the boy who'd once helped his mother plant marigolds around the lake house mailbox. The rain stopped around noon, leaving the world bright and clean, under a sky that looked like it had been scrubbed with steel wool. I decided to drive to the lake house, partly to assess what repairs the autumn storms had caused, but mostly because the place felt like the right setting for whatever came next. The smart home system recognized my approach before I'd even parked, disarming automatically and unlocking the front door with the soft click of technology serving its purpose. Inside, the air held the familiar scent of cedar and wood polish, underlaid with the faintest trace of Margaret's lavender soap. Some presences linger longer than others, and hers had always been stronger than most. I walked through each room slowly, seeing the place through new eyes, not as property to be protected or investment to be managed, but as the repository of 32 years of shared memories. The kitchen where Margaret had made birthday cakes with too much frosting, the living room where we'd played board games during thunderstorms, the master bedroom where she'd planned gardens while I read aloud from mystery novels we'd bought at the used bookstore in town. Every room held evidence of lives well lived, but it was the screened porch that drew me, the space where Margaret had spent her final healthy summer, reading and knitting and watching loons dive for fish in the early morning calm. Her rocking chair still sat in the corner, a faded quilt draped over its back, positioned to catch the best light for needlework and the best view of water that changed color with the sky. I was sitting in the chair beside hers, watching late afternoon shadows stretch across the lake, when I heard a car in the driveway. The smart home app on my phone showed David's SUV pulling up beside the oak tree, but this time he sat for a long moment before getting out, as if gathering courage for a conversation he'd been avoiding for months. He walked to the front door slowly, then stopped and knocked, actually knocked, instead of trying to use the key that no longer worked. The action was small but significant, the difference between assuming access and requesting permission. "Come in," I called, and heard the electronic lock click open. David appeared in the porch doorway carrying a manila envelope and wearing an expression I hadn't seen since he was 12 and had accidentally broken Margaret's favorite garden gnome. Not anger or frustration, but something more complicated, shame mixed with hope, regret tempered by determination. "Dad," he said, taking the chair across from me, "I wanted to apologize for everything. The surveyors, the developers, the way I handled Mom's death and your grief. I've been acting like a stranger." "You have been," I agreed. "The question is whether you remember how to be David again." He handed me the envelope. "I found this in Mom's sewing room when I was packing up her things. It was in her knitting basket under some patterns. I should have given it to you months ago, but I was afraid of what it might say." Inside was a letter in Margaret's careful script, addressed to both of us. "My dearest Richard and David, if you're reading this together, it means the trust has done its work and brought you back to the place that matters most. If you're reading it separately, then one of you still has learning to do. David, by now you've discovered that your inheritance comes with conditions. That was never about punishment. It was about protection. Protection of the lake house, yes, but more importantly, protection of the man I raised you to be. Somewhere along the way you forgot that the best things in life can't be bought or sold, only preserved and shared. Richard, by now you've had to make some hard choices about boundaries and consequences. I know that wasn't easy for you. You've always preferred building bridges to burning them, but sometimes love requires saying no, and sometimes families need to break before they can heal properly. The lake house isn't just property. It's proof that two people can create something larger than themselves, something worth protecting for future generations. David, if you're serious about earning your inheritance, you'll need to understand what stewardship really means. It means caring for something, not because it belongs to you, but because you belong to it. Richard, if our son has chosen to learn, please teach him. Show him how to maintain the dock, how to winterize the plumbing, how to stack firewood so it stays dry through the snow. Show him that stewardship is about daily choices, not grand gestures. And be patient with him. He's been lost for a while, but lost isn't the same as gone forever. The year ahead will test you both. Use it wisely. All my love, Margaret. P.S. David, the combination to your father's gun safe is your mother's birthday. Inside you'll find the deed to a small cabin your grandfather built on Lake Superior. It's been in our family for 70 years, and someday it should be in yours, but only after you've proven you understand the difference between owning something and being owned by it. I folded the letter carefully, my hands steadier than they had been in months. Margaret, still teaching from beyond the grave, still believing that people could change if they had the right motivation and enough time. A cabin on Lake Superior? David asked quietly. Your great-grandfather's fishing cabin, 2 rooms and an outhouse, but it sits on some of the most beautiful water in the world. Your mother wanted you to have it, but she wanted you to earn it first. David was quiet for a long time, staring out at the lake where shadows were gathering with the approaching evening. Finally he spoke, his voice barely above a whisper. I don't know how to be the man she wanted me to be. I don't even know how to be the man I used to be. That's what the next year is for, I said, learning. Your mother always believed that people could grow into their better selves if they had the right soil and enough patience. I stood and walked to the porch railing, looking out at water that reflected the last light of day like a mirror holding memories. The supervision starts now, if you're ready. First lesson, this place needs winterizing before the hard freeze. Pipes drained, dock pulled, storm windows checked. It's not glamorous work, but it's necessary work. David joined me at the railing, standing where he'd stood as a boy, learning to identify different kinds of birds with his mother's field guide. When do we start? We start when you understand why we're doing it. This isn't about following instructions or checking boxes. It's about caring for something that will outlast both of us, something that will shelter other families long after we're gone. He nodded slowly, the gesture of a man accepting responsibility he'd been avoiding for months. I want to understand. I want to learn. The evening light was fading, turning the lake from gold to silver to deep blue. Somewhere across the water, a loon called, its voice wild and lonely in the gathering dusk. Margaret had always said that sound meant home, that places worth keeping were places where wild things felt safe enough to sing. Tomorrow, I said, we'll start with the dock. I'll show you how to pull it properly, how to store it so it lasts another 30 years. And while we work, you can tell me what you remember about this place that has nothing to do with property values. What if I can't remember? Then we'll make new memories worth keeping. That's what stewardship really means. Not just preserving what came before, but creating what comes next. We stood together on the porch as night settled over the lake, father and son learning to be family again, in the place where family had always mattered most. The smart home system continued its electronic vigil, but its protection was no longer needed. The real security came from something simpler and more durable. The understanding that some things were worth the patience it took to preserve them. Inside the house, Margaret's presence lingered in every carefully chosen detail, every lovingly maintained space. But outside, under stars that had watched over this lake for centuries, a new chapter was beginning. One written not in trust documents or legal agreements, but in the daily choices that turned inheritance into legacy and turned strangers back into family. Tomorrow would bring work, and the day after that would bring more work, and slowly, season by season, David would learn what his mother had always known, that the best gifts came with responsibilities, and the most valuable things in life couldn't be bought, only earned through the patient practice of love. The lake house settled around us with the contented sighs of a place that knew it would be cared for, protected not by electronics or legal documents, but by the kind of stewardship that passed from one generation to the next, like a flame that never quite went out, no matter how dark the winter nights became. Spring came early that year, arriving in March with a warmth that surprised everyone, except the daffodils Margaret had planted along the lake house driveway. They pushed through the last patches of snow with the confidence of things that knew their time had come, yellow trumpets announcing that winter's grip was finally loosening. I was sitting on the dock, the same dock David and I had pulled together in October and reinstalled together in April, when I heard the familiar crunch of gravel that meant visitors. The smart home system had been simplified over the winter, reduced to basic security rather than fortress-level protection. Trust, I'd learned, required the possibility of vulnerability. David's SUV appeared through the trees, but it moved slower than it used to, stopping to navigate around the puddles that formed every spring when the frost came out of the ground. Through the windshield, I could see two small faces pressed against the glass. Emma, now 6, and her younger brother Jake, who'd turned 4 in February and had never seen the lake house awake from its winter sleep. "Grandpa Richard!" Emma burst from the car before David had fully stopped, her red boots splashing through puddles as she ran toward the dock. "Did the fish come back? Mom said the fish come back when the ice melts." "They did indeed," I said, catching her in a hug that smelled like strawberry shampoo and childhood excitement. "Want to see if we can spot any?" Jake followed more cautiously, the way 4-year-olds approach new experiences, with curiosity tempered by uncertainty. David brought up the rear, carrying a cooler, and wearing the kind of comfortable clothes that meant he'd finally learned the difference between visiting and working. "How does the dock look?" he asked, running his hand along the railing we'd sanded and stained together the previous fall. His touch was proprietary now, but in the right way, the way someone touches something they've earned the right to care for. "Solid as the day we built it," I said. "Your great-grandfather knew what he was doing when he designed these floating sections, flexible enough to ride out the ice, strong enough to last a lifetime." The past 6 months had taught us both about flexibility and strength. David had failed some tests, arriving late for winterization work, forgetting to check the furnace filter, initially balking at the cost of proper roof maintenance. But he'd passed the ones that mattered, spending Christmas morning here with the children while Sandra visited her parents, learning to split firewood with the methodical patience the task required, sitting through an entire evening of my stories about building the place without once checking his phone. "Can we go fishing, Grandpa?" Emma had inherited Margaret's directness, the ability to cut through adult conversation to reach what actually mattered. "After lunch," David said before I could answer. "We've got some work to do first." I raised an eyebrow. "Work?" "Mom's garden," he said, gesturing toward the plot where Margaret had grown vegetables and flowers in cheerful chaos. "Sandra and I talked about it over the winter. The kids should learn where food comes from, and Emma's been asking about great-grandma's roses." The garden had been dormant since Margaret's death, too painful to maintain and too precious to abandon. I'd mowed over it the first summer, but the roses had kept returning, stubborn as love itself. Last fall, David had quietly cleared the weeds and covered the soil with mulch, saying nothing, but working with the careful attention Margaret would have recognized. "What did you have in mind?" I asked. "Nothing fancy, tomatoes, maybe some beans, flowers for the dinner table. Emma wants to plant sunflowers because they grow taller than she is." Emma nodded vigorously. "And Jake wants carrots because rabbits eat them in his books." We spent the morning preparing the garden beds, David and I doing the heavy work, while the children collected stones for the border Margaret had always maintained. Emma chattered constantly, asking questions about soil and seeds and why worms were good for gardens. Jake worked silently, methodically placing stones in careful rows with the concentration of someone building something important. "He's got your focus," I told David during a water break. "And Margaret's stubbornness," David replied, watching his son adjust and readjust the stone border until it met his 4-year-old standards of perfection. He spent an hour yesterday arranging his toy cars by color and size. Sandra said it reminded her of Mom organizing her sewing supplies. The mention of Margaret felt natural now, part of the conversation rather than an interruption to it. David had learned to speak of his mother without the guilty edge that had marked his voice for months after her death. The children helped with that. They had no complicated relationship with grief, only curiosity about the grandmother they'd barely known, but whose presence filled every corner of the lake house. By afternoon, we had 3 rows planted and watered, marked with wooden stakes labeled in Emma's careful printing: tomatoes, bayonets, and flowers for the table. The misspellings were charming, rather than correctable. Margaret would have left them exactly as they were, understanding that perfection could wait while growth took its own time. "Now, can we fish?" Emma asked, wiping dirt from her hands with the unself-conscious efficiency of someone who'd learned that getting dirty was part of getting things done. We spent the rest of the afternoon on the dock, Emma and Jake learning to cast with the patience of children who understood that good things required practice. David had become a competent teacher over the winter, having relearned the skills I'd taught him 20 years earlier. Watching him guide Jake's small hands on the fishing rod, I saw flashes of the boy he'd been, focused, gentle, willing to repeat instructions without frustration. "I've been thinking about the cabin," David said quietly while the children concentrated on their bobbers. "The one Mom mentioned in her letter. Lake Superior's beautiful in summer. Your great-grandfather used to say it was the closest thing to ocean you could find in the middle of the continent. Would you come with us? When we're ready, I mean. When I've earned it." The question carried weight beyond its simple words. David was asking not just for permission to claim his inheritance, but for my presence in that claiming, my blessing, my continued involvement in the family he was learning to build, rather than just provide for. "I'd be honored," I said, and meant it. The sun was setting when we finally packed up the fishing gear and cleaned the 2 small bluegills Emma had managed to catch. She insisted on carrying them to the kitchen herself, where David showed her how to clean them properly. Another skill passed down through generations of people who understood that taking from nature meant treating it with respect. Sandra arrived just as we were finishing dinner, her car loaded with overnight bags and the kind of supplies that suggested she'd finally decided the lake house was worth investing in rather than merely visiting. She hugged the children, kissed David, and surprised me by asking to see the garden. "It looks exactly like I imagined it would," she said, studying the neat rows and careful stone borders. "Emma's been talking about it for weeks." "Your mother-in-law would have loved having the children help," I said. "She always said gardens were better when they had small hands to tend them." Sandra nodded, and for the first time since I'd known her, she seemed genuinely present rather than performing presence. "I'm sorry I didn't understand that before, about what this place meant to your family. To our family." The evening passed quietly, children's voices mixing with adult conversation as the lake house filled with the sounds it had been designed to hold. Emma fell asleep on the couch with a picture book about fish, while Jake constructed elaborate towers from the blocks Margaret had kept in the toy chest for visiting grandchildren who might someday exist. Later, after the children were in bed and Sandra was reading on the screened porch, David and I walked down to the dock for the kind of conversation that required starlight and the gentle sound of water against wooden posts. "I've been thinking about the supervision period," he said, "about what happens when it ends. What do you want to happen?" "I want to keep learning, not because I have to, but because I need to. This place, what Mom built here, what you've preserved, it's bigger than ownership. It's about understanding that some things are worth more than they cost." I nodded, thinking about the trust documents that would soon transfer full ownership to a man who'd finally learned the difference between having something and deserving it. "Your mother would be proud of who you've become, who you're still becoming." "I hope so. I hope when Emma and Jake are my age, they'll understand why this mattered enough to fight for." Above us, stars reflected in the lake's dark surface, creating the illusion of depth that went all the way to the center of the earth. Margaret used to say that was what love looked like, surface beauty that hinted at something infinite beneath, something worth diving into, even when you couldn't see the bottom. "They'll understand," I said, "because you'll teach them, the way your mother taught you, the way my father taught me. That's how stewardship works. It passes from one pair of hands to the next, carrying the same responsibility, but adapting to new circumstances." We stood in comfortable silence, watching the lake breathe in the gentle rhythm that had soothed countless generations of families who'd found their way to these shores. Somewhere in the distance, a loon called, that wild, lonely sound that Margaret had always said meant home. "Thank you," David said finally, "for not giving up on me, for making me earn this instead of just inheriting it. Thank your mother. This was her plan from the beginning. She just knew you'd need time to grow into it." The next morning brought coffee on the porch and the sight of Emma trying to teach Jake how to skip stones, while Sandra took photographs of everything with the enthusiasm of someone documenting memories she finally understood were worth keeping. David worked on the dock railing, sanding spots where winter ice had left rough patches, humming under his breath, the way Margaret used to when she was content with her work. I sat in Margaret's rocking chair, reading the newspaper while keeping one eye on the children and the other on the man my son was becoming. The smart home system recorded it all silently, but its purpose had changed from protection to preservation, creating a digital archive of family moments that would matter more with each passing year. By noon, they were packing to leave, the SUV loaded with leftover food and children tired from fresh air and new experiences. Emma hugged me goodbye with the fierce affection of someone who'd decided I belonged in her life permanently. "When can we come back, Grandpa?" she asked. "Whenever you want," I said. "This is your family's place now. It'll be here waiting whenever you need it." David shook my hand, a formal gesture that carried informal weight. "See you next weekend. I want to start on those storm windows you mentioned." "I'll be here." After they left, I walked through the lake house slowly, seeing it through new eyes once again. Not as property to be protected or legacy to be preserved, but as a living space where family continued to happen, generation by generation, season by season. The children's fingerprints on the windows, the scent of Sandra's coffee lingering in the kitchen, the sound of David's laughter echoing from the dock. All of it woven into the fabric of a place that had learned to hold love in its walls and boards and carefully tended gardens. That evening, I called Mr. Patterson to begin the final transfer paperwork. The supervision period wasn't technically over for another 3 months, but some things became clear before their official deadlines arrived. "Are you certain?" he asked. "The trust allows you to extend the supervision if you feel more time is needed." "He's ready," I said, watching the sun set over water that had witnessed decades of family stories. More importantly, he understands what ready means. 2 weeks later, the deed transfer was complete. David's name appeared on the ownership documents alongside Margaret's trust provisions, which would remain in effect permanently, ensuring that future generations would inherit not just property, but responsibility, not just rights, but obligations to preserve what mattered most. The lake house settled into its new chapter, with the quiet confidence of a place that knew it would be cared for. The smart home system continued its gentle vigilance, but its alerts now documented family arrivals rather than intrusions, celebrations rather than confrontations. And on quiet evenings when the lake was still and the loons called across water that reflected 1,000 stars, I could almost hear Margaret's voice on the wind, whispering that some battles were worth fighting, some lessons were worth teaching, and some loves were strong enough to survive even the complications of being human. The trust had done its work. The family had found its way home.